feel bad. I'm adding any length addition to your day because there's some great speakers after me as well. And so first of all, just thank you for being here and for having so much of your day and kind of absorbing so much information. My message is actually fairly simple today. I'll probably make it more complicated than it needs to be. But you've seen some amazing presentations about the role of technology, the role of data, the importance of kind of the fourth industrial revolution, as Rob was laying out very eloquently. I want to talk about the role of nature. And how we often lose sight of nature and kids, frankly, in this conversation. There's two very different visions of the future that haven't necessarily always been articulated as such, but there's one vision that I think many folks, technologists, I would maybe call them broadly, are talking about. We're basically just substituting the technologies of the third industrial revolution, so coal and fossil fuels, for clean energy, but everything else basically stays the same. And that we're more efficient, we're using resources more efficiently, but that we're basically continuing to operate the same way we have more or less. We just have cleaner energy, less carbon emissions. Then there's a second vision that I think is a little more complicated, much harder to articulate, which is actually trying to find ways to actually restore the balance between the way we live with nature. And right now, across our country, right here in the state of Idaho, the imbalance is pretty scary. Right now there are more than 8,000 wildlife species just in the United States, just in the contiguous 48, lower 48 states, right now that are at risk of having potential extinction in the next century. Monarch butterflies, the simple monarch butterfly, the beautiful butterfly we all studied in 4th grade, 90% decline since 15 years ago. 90% decline. You look at pollinator populations across the board, maybe we're at 50% decline. And at the same time, we have a younger generation that's spending 30 to 50 hours a week in front of some kind of screen, spending more time playing video games than actually enjoying the outdoors. And as much as we made efforts around science, technology, engineering, and math to connect kids with the kind of the very tools that we'll need to solve the crises that we're all talking about here, that actual connection, that visceral connection to nature is being lost. And so one of the things I encourage all of you to think about as we're thinking about this bigger picture of resilience is how do we make sure that nature, that conservation is at the center of all that we do, and at the same time, how do we make sure we have a kind of environmentally literate and nature engaged kind of next generation to carry the baton, to inherit hopefully the progress that we've made, but likely the deficit that we've left for them for the next generation. I'll talk about a couple different examples, but there's 3 things I want each of you to hopefully take away from my few minutes here today. And the first one is that I don't think we can address the challenge of the 21st century unless the way we live with nature is at the center of the public policy debate. There is no way to do the things we're talking about. I would love to see clean energy replace dirtier fuels. I would love to see us reduce kind of the staggering kind of projections for temperature rise to more like a degree and a half, 2 degrees centigrade. I would love that, but if we do it in a way that's not with nature, first of all, we have missed a huge opportunity, and frankly, we not necessarily have left the world in a better place than it would have otherwise. The second thing is that if we don't figure out a way to get kids at scale educated around science, technology, engineering, math, with environmental literacy being part of this, the disengagement of those students in this effort will be the catastrophic reason that it fails, if it does. And so figuring out a way around that is incredibly important. And right now, I'll use my nephew as an example. I have a nephew that's brilliant. Loves to talk about kind of sustainable things. He's the one telling his parents to turn off the lights. He's the one saying we should recycle. He's the one doing all these sustainable things. If you gave him his choice between playing outdoors or playing some video game in his basement, he will choose the iPad or the Xbox in his basement almost every time. And so there's this intellectual disconnect. And you see this actually in polling among millennials also, where they all care about climate. Climate score is actually very high. But if you actually look at the way they spend their time, there's a segment that spends a ton of time in nature, an absolute ton of time in nature. But for the average millennial, they're not spending much time engaged at all. And I would argue that disconnect between the amount of the passion they have for an issue intellectually, because they know that's something they should care about, versus the way they spend their time with the things that they have that visceral love for, is a very terrifying thing. It's something we need to actually wrap our arms around. And then the third thing, on a more optimistic note, is that if we figure out a way to embrace nature in a big way, nature can actually provide many of the solutions to many of the challenges that we are facing, particularly around resilience. There aren't man-engineered solutions often are not nearly as effective as the nature-based solutions in many of these areas. That's why I was so excited about Rick's example of kind of the IPO value of the tree, if that was invented today by some Silicon Valley genius. So kind of going through these just kind of one at a time, the imbalance that we have right now is pretty worrisome. And I'm just going to use one example. that I think kind of demonstrates the challenge when you kind of focus on technology and kind of having technology be the solution to everything, maybe lose sight of the natural resource implications. And that's actually advanced biofuels in general. And there's a conversation 5 or 6 years ago, actually 7 or 8 years ago now, that began specifically around how do we incentivize advanced biofuels to become kind of the savior and kind of replace fossil fuels. At the time, there was more concern about energy independence because this is before the fracking revolution kind of destroyed a lot of habitat in the Dakotas. And very good intentions, very, very good intentions. So the idea was we're going to have a domestic source product, we're going to have next generation technologies, we're going to boost local rural economies, we're going to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and foreign oil. Very, very laudable goals. Let me flash forward 7, 8 years from when that mandate was put in place during the end of the Bush administration. We've lost millions and millions of acres of habitat. We haven't seen the promise of advanced biofuels because the last generation ethanol has basically crowded out a lot of investment in the marketplace. There were promises given at the time that we were going to not have any additional acres of land being lost. But the University of Wisconsin and the USDA and other agencies will tell you that we've lost 8 to 10 million acres of habitat, primarily grasslands in places like the Dakotas, like Nebraska, like Iowa, wetlands in places like the Great Lakes, forests in the southeast. We're even growing things like ethanol and we're growing corn for ethanol right now in the panhandle of Texas, which is as close to a desert as many of you know. And to make matters worse, to meet that demand, which is completely created by government, we're pulling water out of aquifers at alarming rates to water land that really isn't tillable, is pretty arid to begin with, and then you have to apply a ton of nutrients on top of that land as a way to make sure that the corn production grows. A lot of which of those nutrients end up washing into the waterways that we care so much about, creating massive algal blooms and causing problems. When this initiative started, right, environmentalists were all over. It's like, this is fantastic because this is going to get us the next generation biofuels, which I'm still a big proponent of. Cellulosic has huge potential, algae, there's a lot of technologies that are exciting. But we forgot the nature piece of this. We forgot actually thinking about what are the impacts on the ecosystem. Let me just tell you some of the impacts really quickly. The impacts that we've seen, I use monarchs as an example. A lot of those acres of milkweed habitat that's so important for their survival have been lost as we're figuring out more and more ways to have more and more crops on more and more acres to meet this demand. Because $6 or $7 a bushel corn sure as hell beats getting a little bit of money from a government program to have a little bit of habitat on the margins. And so this is just one example. And I could do the same thing for pheasants. I could do the same thing for waterfowl population. I could do the same thing for meadowlarks or longspurs or all kinds of species. But it's just an example of how we have to be thoughtful to make sure that the world we're leaving behind as we're advancing technological solutions is actually working in harmony with nature and creating that balance with nature. Wildlife shouldn't have to lose so technology can win. And so that's one kind of big theme. The second theme that I want to leave you with is around kids. Because I'm very nervous about the amount of time that kids are spending disconnected from nature. And many of us in this room, kind of two different generations in this room, I was in kind of the generation I would consider kind of a watershed. There were a whole lot of other things to do. There were things like kids that the Nintendos, Ataris, Segas, AOL. There's kind of those first technologies that are coming online in the mid '80s and into the '90s. And there were kids that still had a lot of time outside. Maybe their kids were getting sent outside during the summer hours. Kind of going out all day and building forts and playing in the streams. But then there were a whole other group of kids that basically just worked on the technology. And which is great. We've had amazing innovation because of it, because you've seen the kind of the rise of computer literacy, the expansion of the internet, which is fantastic. The challenge is those folks are also becoming parents. And a lot of them know their kids should be spending more time outside. They're concerned about the iPad being like the cheapest babysitter this world's ever created. For $600, you can basically have your kid mesmerized for hours at a time. But they don't know how to do it because they haven't actually experienced it themselves. And so one of the things I spend a lot of time on, this gets back to the resilience of the overall movement in these kinds of investments, is that if we don't figure out a way to reconnect kids with nature at scale, starting in the classroom in many cases, and we have an amazing eco schools program that tries to do this. We're in about 8,000 schools across the country. Starting in the schools to actually provide that information, because a lot of times the parents themselves can't do it entirely on their own. But then connecting that experience in the classroom and actually moving it outdoors. And I'm not saying they have to go to an amazing place up north of Stanley, and be in the salmon or the snake up here, or my wife and I, my wife Krishanti's over here. She and I were just down. We did the grand tour of all the national parks in Utah in about 36 hours. And yes, you can actually get from Zion to Bryce to Capitol Reef to Arches all in one day. It is actually physically possible, and actually do 2 to 3 mile hikes in each of them. we need to find ways to connect kids to nature where they live and do this at scale. And this is one thing that the Federation is extremely kind of focused on right now, because I would argue that the best way to learn science, technology, engineering, and math is through the lens of nature. Like, what better way to understand the kind of the physical sciences than having concrete examples in your backyard, a schoolyard garden, a backyard habitat? I mean, these are easy ways to kind of connect these things and make these concepts that tend to be fairly esoteric in some ways when you're just in a textbook, very concrete, very real, and have the problems that they solve by learning those tools very tangible. So that's kind of the second piece that I'm just hoping will be part of the thinking as we're thinking about kind of becoming resilient and kind of think of resilient solutions. So obviously, kind of the central focus on nature and making sure we're living more in harmony. The second piece with having more of a focus on kids and bringing them along in a way that is supportive of the overall effort. And then the third piece that I think is equally important is thinking about nature as a solution to many of the resilience challenges that we face. Through the Army Corps of Engineers in this country, we have figured out ways to build seawalls. We figured out ways to build riprap and all kinds of coastal defenses, most of which were not designed for the level of storms that we're facing. We have figured out ways in this country to drain aquifers, to have a little bit more water for agriculture and irrigation. We have figured out ways to rechannelize waterways. We've figured out ways to basically abuse the natural resources to an extent that would make even Teddy Roosevelt, who's digging the Panama Canal, blush. 100 years ago. Those very systems that we've degraded over and over again, the wetlands that we built over in places like Washington, D.C., the wetlands we've lost on the East Coast, for example, the aquifers that are being drained right here in Idaho, the systems that were the coastal systems, the dune systems that we built all over on the East Coast or a little bit in the West Coast, in places that aren't too high. Those are the very systems that if we can figure out a way to reinvest in and actually build to and actually repair, will be the most important line of defense for the type of extreme weather we're going to experience. I want to tell one little quick story from my time in Delaware. I had the privilege of serving on a great governor, a guy named Jack Markell, who's former McKinsey. He's U Chicago, very, very smart, intellectual guy. And we tried to prove out the case that investing those natural resources would be a better way to improve the resilience of the state than almost anything else we could do with kind of traditional engineered solutions. And when Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Irene hit Delaware, there was a lot of damage in a lot of places. And the storm tracks were slightly north of us in one case and slightly, kind of bounced around a little bit in the other case. But one of the reasons that you didn't hear a lot about major fatalities in Delaware, you didn't hear about property loss, is that the tens of millions of dollars that we invested in restoring wetlands, in making sure that we had living shorelines, making sure that we had healthy dune systems, they worked. And so, not exactly, the challenges facing Idaho directly are a little different, right? It's going to be more about the preservation of fresh water systems. It's going to be making sure that we're basically making sure that those systems are abundant enough and kind of used in a rate that's sustainable enough, so we're not kind of mortgaging the future by using those resources today. But these natural systems work, and it's something that I'm hoping folks will think about. A lot of the natural systems are frankly better than anything that the best technologists coming out of the top universities in the world can engineer. And there's also opportunities to actually leverage those systems with other with man-made technologies to have even stronger solutions. And so again, as we're thinking about this, I think it's very sexy to think about the kind of the technological solutions, and they're incredibly important. I spent 3 years working for the mayor of San Jose, California. It was fascinating to have the opportunity to see technologies in those kind of early incubation stages, and some made it and some didn't, and some are changing the world, and other guys are on to the next venture. But we can't lose sight of the piece of nature. And I just have this one slide behind me. You guys have seen enough slides today and enough charts you couldn't read from your seats. This stuff matters, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we want healthy salmon runs in the Northwest. We want to make sure there's abundant grizzly populations. We want to make sure that the 8,000 species that I mentioned at the top are able to sustain in a way that they're healthy and abundant for future generations. This doesn't have to be an either or. But a lot of the conversation, and I'll just challenge folks on the left, it's become a technology urban conversation. Frankly, if we talk about it this way, this will be my final thought, I promise. If you actually talk about it through the lens of nature, talk about the impacts on the need for resilience work because we want to have healthier trout streams, because the trout populations aren't spawning at the same rates because the temperatures are too high in the water. Talk about the impacts on big game species. Talk about the impacts on pollinators. All of a sudden, the politics change dramatically, because that's not a Republican or Democratic issue at that point. We can debate the solutions. We can debate EPA regulations versus carbon taxes versus other types of investments. But we've made this issue so complicated to talk about and so polarized in the way that we talk about it. I want to make sure when I'm giving a speech talking about natural resources that folks have no idea whether I'm a Republican or a Democrat. I want to make sure that they're not thinking about which party I want to affiliate with, where the money's going for campaigns. but they care about it because they care about their local backyard. One of the reasons I've been so inspired by the work that Amy has been leading here is that it's so focused on the resilience of the valley, right, of Sun Valley. Because if you can do great things here, it's replicable other places. But by starting with that local piece, instead of talking about the Maldives, instead of talking about polar ice caps, instead of talking about things that are a world away, frankly, that most Americans will never get to see, if we start talking about the things that are being impacted in our own backyard, where we fish, where we hunt, where we hike, where we camp, where we paddle, all of a sudden the conversations begin to shift. So as you're listening to great speakers the next day and a half, please pay attention, think about investment opportunities in all the technologies, because there's a ton of them, and there are trillions of dollars to be made. On the risk side, there's a ton of money to be made on the insurance side, and frankly, government policies are one of the things we need to fix to make sure there's more private investment in resilience. Because I think a lot of government policies where we subsidize harmful behaviors like building on dunes are actually part of the root cause. But don't forget the role of nature, don't forget the importance of kids, and don't forget that nature can be a solution to the very things we care about. Thank you very much for having me.